Bram Stoker, Mary Shelley, Horace Walpole, Edgar Allan Poe. These writers were key figures in the development of what we now know as the Gothic genre. Often these days, the Gothic genre has been reduced to the color black, archaic settings, rock music, and goth girls. But in reality, the Gothic is a surprisingly deep and very in-depth look as a result of being the antithesis of typical storytelling. Rose Engine Signalis is a horror game released on October 27, 2022, and revolves around a robot, or in this case, a replica, named Elster 512, better known as Elster, as she searches for her missing crewmate while facing a combination of psychological and supernatural torment. Now, I'm not necessarily here to make a breakdown of the themes of the story. Hell, there are creators that have done a phenomenal job at that. However, I would like to create the argument on how Signalis qualifies as a Gothic, or better yet, a Neo-Gothic tragedy. Now, without further ado, let's dive into the history of the Gothic and the somber story of Signalis. To better understand the context, Signalis revolves around the android Elster 512, German for magpie, or just Elster, a robotic ship technician who awakens in her ship, the Penrose 512, in search of her missing crewmate, Ariana Young. The game is mainly set in the S-23 Sierpinski mining facility before transitioning to otherworldly locations that transcend reality. The game takes on a more retro style compared to its more modern counterparts, coupled with older and more outdated features that make it stand out as an indie game. Now that that has been established, we need to understand what is the Gothic genre. Now this may seem inapplicable, as typically the Gothic is defined by a medieval or archaic setting, a depressing or gloomy atmosphere, dark dungeons or mansions, and goth girls! Okay, I'll stop. But seriously though, looking back historically, the Gothic genre essentially paved the way for the modern horror genre that we know today. And it all started in 1764. A writer named Horace Walpole published a novel, The Castle of Otranto, which was one of the first horror novels, and as time went on, other stories emerged that expanded the genre, such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein or the modern Prometheus, Bram Stoker's Dracula, aka my favorite Gothic and romance ever, Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Edgar Allan Poe's many poems, such as The Fall of the House of Usher, The Raven, The Pit and the Pendulum, aka my dad's favorite. As for the term Gothic itself, it was originally founded on the attributes of the Goths, the people of Germania, the northern region of pre-medieval Europe, and who covered a vast amount of land from now modern-day Spain all the way to modern-day Bosnia and Herzegovina, in the form of the Visigoths to the Ostrogoths. This group was made distinct for their view as barbaric tribesmen that laid waste to whatever they came across, especially against the Romans, to the point that they were considered a factor in the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 AD. Around the 1100s, there came the debut of Gothic architecture, starting in northern France and eventually centering itself mostly around Germany, which grew as a revision or reimagination of the aesthetic of the Goths, or an imagination of what it would have looked like. This was attributed by a look that was considered at the time ugly and savage over the perceived behavior of the Goths. However, the Gothic would also take a new meaning in Catholicism, for it was the main aesthetic used for churches at the time, in which I feel is best explained by Miss Anna Isabel over here.
The aesthetic first emerged in the Middle Ages as an architectural style among religious structures like cathedrals and temples, typically used to represent the majesty and mysticism of the divine. Spires, stained glass windows, floral motifs, and decorative curls, all these elaborate style elements were commonly used to represent the beauty and magnificence of a higher power.
Before and especially around the Victorian era, there came the time for another revision known as the Gothic Revival period that had architects recreating the Gothic image in the post-modern day. Walpole himself spent an exorbitant amount of money in order to create a house based around this aesthetic, which is now his famous Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham, England, where he had a nightmare which led him to creating the Castle of Otranto. Overall, the Gothic thematically revolves around ideas of revisionism of the past, which would also be paired by a plethora of other themes forever marked by and popularized by Walpole's novel. Now, how does this go to Signalis, which does not replicate many of these aesthetics? To best understand this is to break down the core materials of what makes a story a Gothic, which this next part will be divided into 9 aspects. Mystery serves as the driving force of a Gothic, creating conflict and the laying out of the story for the protagonist. In Signalis, this takes form around Elster trying to find her crewmate, Ariana Young, only to realize that there is something else that lies beyond her lost crewmate. It is later revealed that Ariana is more than just Elster's crewmate and superior, but her lover as well, which also caused a time loop to begin essentially locking Elster in a repetitive state of time until she fulfills a promise she made to Ariana. The dark aesthetic visualizes everything that would be carried out in a Gothic story by creating an image of decaying or antiquated environments, dark colors, and often spiritual imagery, be it religious, occult, or supernatural. In Signalis, this is done by creating environments that look to be long inhabited but is now occupied by the monsters that wander across the Sierpinski, and later changing to masses of flesh that flood it. In the modern day, the depiction of a villain portrayed in a Gothic story is made distinct as the genre changed to horror. In your traditional modern horror movie, the villain, whether or not they're supernatural, is depicted as a powerful individual, traditionally a man, but not limited to it, that racks up a high death count. Think of villains such as Michael Myers from Halloween, Jason Voorhees from Friday the 13th, Freddy Krueger from A Nightmare on Elm Street, and Art the Clown from Terrifier. A more traditional Gothic villain would still be depicted as having some kind of power, but that is not the sole aspect. This type of villain is more of a depressing or decrepit failure of a character, in which to emphasize that is also a very broad term, that can make them seem more sympathetic and even tragic, often due to their environment. In modern times, these depictions would be more akin to Count Dracula from Dracula, Count Orlok from Nosferatu, Frankenstein's monster from Frankenstein, the Beldam from Coraline, and arguably Leatherface from the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre. In Signalis, this takes the form of Adler S2301, German for eagle, aka Adler. Not only because he's the only guy in the entire cast, but also his attempts to stop Elster is because of his purpose as a replica. Essentially, replicas are androids that have the consciousness of a once living person but had those memories suppressed in exchange for their functionality for the authoritarian Oysan nation. This can be compared to servitors from Warhammer 40k or replicants. See what I did there? You see what I did there? From the Blade Runner movies. whose sole existence is to essentially live in a perpetual state of existing non-existence. Should one get the promised ending, which is presumably the canon one, but then again, it's the real ending is really up in the air. Adler's constant attempts to stop Elster from repeating the cycle would be met with nothing and absolute failure. During the writing of the Castle of Otranto, women in literature were not necessarily as prominent figures in conflict, lest it be for the goal for a romance plot or a side character of little importance. However, the novel created a way for women to become not only a protagonist, but also to subvert the traditional view of women in media. Typically, these heroines are depicted as unfit or beleaguered for their situation, which forces them to confront the antagonist head-on and often on their own. This doesn't always mean they're weak though, and as modern media evolved, so did the representation of women themselves, especially in the horror genre, with characters like Ellen Ripley from Alien, Clarice Starling from Silence of the Lambs, Laurie Strode from Halloween, Coraline from Coraline, and Lee Harker from Longlegs, who are shining examples of this long-standing tradition and is also arguably the most common tradition of the Gothic as it changed into horror. It's also important to note that male protagonists are also a thing in Gothic media, but often women are the central focus rather than men, especially in a Gothic romance. Signalis amplifies this, with Elster, not only for obvious reasons, but also as her role as a replica, whose role is that of a ship technician and navigator. Hell, it's in her true name, Landwärmesungs- und Schifftechniker Replika 512. This also puts her at odds against more combat-oriented replicas, such as Star, German for Starling, that acts as the Sierpinski's security force, aka the Sicherheitstechniker Aufseherreplika, Colibri, German for Hummingbird, the Communications and Squad Orientation Group that buzz Elster's frequency and psychological comprehension, aka das Kommando Leitenheit Bioresonanztechniker Replika, and Falke, the commander and overseer of all combat and security forces spread throughout the Sierpinski, aka das Führungskommando Leitenheit Replika. The intrusions of the past help add context towards the mystery, as well as help the protagonist or audience better understand the situation they're in. This can come in the form of prophecies or flashbacks that would play a role, or be it influential or prophetic in the story. Signalis does this by thrusting the perspective into a first-person view instead of the game's isometric view, depicting otherworldly visions of importance, such as a classroom of a young Ariana being bullied in school, a train sequence of Ariana sitting alone, and a beachside littered with quotes from Robert W. Chambers' The King in Yellow, and the beach alone being implied to be a prominent painting of Arnold Böcklin's Die Toteninsel. This would also help better flesh out the dynamics of Elster and Ariana's relationship, mainly showing how Ariana got to where she is in the first place, as well as to how they grow to become a couple, and a tragically wholesome one at that. Arguably the most prevalent aspect in all of Gothic culture. Melancholy sets the tone of the story. This tone can also be paired with other themes such as hopelessness, loss, sadness, and longing. This also throws out the idea of a happy ending being possible, as often Gothic stories end in absolute manners, emphasizing the gravity of their respective stories. In Signalis, this is best emphasized by its switches from frantic horror to slow and gloomy moments, which are arguably the most memorable parts of the game. This is especially booted by an amazing soundtrack produced by 1000 Eyes and Cicada Sirens, whose slower songs give off feelings of emptiness, longing, and sadness, as well as a sense of surrealism. As a counter to the epic for containing moments of grandiosity and multiple locations, the domestic setting is more tied to the tragedy genre, which allows the story to be carried out more dramatically and intensely by focusing on a singular location. This is done by creating a claustrophobic environment which ramps up the intensity by putting the protagonist into forced situations of a perceived threat. In Gothic stories, they explore usually archaic or abandoned areas such as manors, castles, and dungeons. In more modern day depictions, these can also include factories, downtown areas of cities, and towns. Signalis does this with the S-23 Sierpinski mining facility, a long dilapidated mining plant that descends into that of near cosmic horror the deeper Elster goes. It also takes on a retro-futuristic aesthetic based on the Cold War, which gives off a darkly futuristic feel while ramping up the intensity with a feeling of isolation by the Sierpinski's desolate planet of Leng. The idea of ruin can be taken in two fashions with this aspect. As a staple of horror and preceded by the tragedy genre, ruin is represented in both a physical and narrative sense. By physical sense, this is done by the destruction of everything in absolute totality and leaving out the chance for something to be fixed, and on a narrative sense, it also spells the ruin of the characters, which leave out the idea of a happy ending in general. In Signalis, ruin is best exemplified with the endings. No matter which ending Elster endures, they always come at a great loss for her, and it also cements that in the end, her and Ariana cannot be together, and never will be. One ending is the promise ending, where Elster fulfills the promise she made to Ariana by strangling her to death before croaking beside her. Another ending comes in the form of Elster finding a white lily, which ends off with her and Ariana dancing together in the ruins of the Penrose. This ending specifically is unclear, but some people speculate that after enduring the time loop repeatedly, Elster essentially locks herself in her own delusion and goes insane, which is arguably the saddest one out of all of them. Other than melancholy, the supernatural is the second most prominent role in Gothic stories. This is a very broad type of view, as the supernatural, by all intents and purposes, is just the state of something that transcends the standard conventions of reality, ranging from the previously mentioned intrusions of the past, religious or occult activity, and the presence of monsters like ghosts, vampires, and witches. In Signalis, this is done by Ariana, who is the main cause for the Sierpinski to be locked in a perpetual state of time that revolves all around her, with the only way to break it is for Elster to fulfill her aforementioned promise. Another example is by the ever-changing environment, such as Elster's descent into the environment Nowhere, giving her no map data, and by using older puzzles such as riddles and rings, and the weighted Matirashkadel puzzles. Oh my god, I just butchered that, I'm so sorry. Compared to the Sierpinski's technical puzzles. The last supernatural aspect to mention is that Elster finds herself walking through the multiple different planets, such as the snowy landscape of Leng inhabiting the Sierpinski, the red desert of Kitej, and Rodfront, Ariana's home planet. Now that all of these aspects have been made apparent, the next section will elaborate on the genre/theme of tragedy in the game. Now that the game has been implied to be Gothic, let us quickly cover the theme of tragedy, genre of tragedy. As stated here and there, the tragic and Gothic stories often have similarities, especially with domestic settings and ruinous themes. But there is more to this than just similarities, and without elaborating too much, as the tragedy genre is a surprisingly deep and complex genre in itself, and I assume this video is already getting a little too long. Signalis takes hold of this genre as well into creating a depressingly beautiful story of their star-crossed lovers. Principally, the tragedy genre has a very specific goal to pursue, and that main goal is to understand suffering. Within this carves out a story where essentially the fate of the protagonist is often pre-told, or at the very least implied. Signalis presents this by the phrase, "Remember our promise." This makes the audience think initially, what promise? It was never implied until the end, when the promise was revealed to end Ariana's suffering. Think of it as a curse that can only be lifted by the protagonist, aka the lover, aka Elster. Overall, the tragedy within the story is that no matter what Elster does, and despite enduring the cycle over and over again, and laying waste to the Sierpinski countless times, Elster's love for Ariana stayed steadfast, only for it to never be fulfilled. Not in one life, nor the next, nor will it ever be in absolute totality. Neo. Greek for new. While not necessarily a genre in itself, is best described as taking older forms of media and recreating them in a breath of fresh air, while still giving homage to it. Over the past few years, modern media has seen a great series of these renditions of the stories of old, from reimaginations of older films to inspirations of the old into creating something completely new. John Wick reimagined the action genre while taking inspiration of les films noirs of the 1940s. Denis Villeneuve's Dune reimagined Frank Herbert's sci-fi classic with a vision resembling European comic book art from the 1970s. And Robert Eggers' The Lighthouse takes old film styles into creating a psychological film of... I'm gonna be honest, I don't even know. It's just like Robert Pattinson having beef with a seagull for 2 hours. Like, I'm gonna be honest, the movie kind of confuses me, but it is phenomenal, regardless. Call it a neo-renaissance. But this rising trend can be traced back to the idea of reminiscence and reimagination of the Gothic, or in other words, to recreate something old as a form of rebirth. In the realm of video games, there saw a recent rise of releases that went back to a simpler time. A popular example of this is the boomer shooter genre, where new games were specifically designed to be more reminiscent of FPSs from the 1990s, such as Doom and Quake. Another genre that takes these themes head-on would be the horror genre. In fact, some of their oldest games often take inspiration from the Gothic genre itself, with games such as Silent Hill, Resident Evil, and Amnesia, in terms of themes and aesthetics. Similar to how horror evolved with film, the horror game evolved into multiple different genres to expand how to encapsulate fear. But as time went on, horror also began to regress into using more older visuals and features, which arguably amped up the fear factor compared to more modern horror games, using more modern or realistic graphics. That being said, the best example of this Neo-Gothic or revisionist recreation of the old came by the eventual development of Signalis, which can serve as a callback to a callback to a callback. So, one may wonder, where does all this go? Essentially, there is something important that must be taken when looking at this game through this specific lens. So here are the pieces of the proverbial puzzle put together. 1. Signalis nails home on all the traditional aspects of a Gothic story, which, as of these days, does not always follow the modern conventions of a horror piece. 2. The game calls back to an older time in the same way the Gothic has to the medieval era, and while it was not necessarily so medieval as it is more retro-futuristic, it still calls back to a certain point in history. To further elaborate on this, the design of the game is reminiscent of the Cold War society, from the use of technology such as floppy disks and old computers, the weapons resembling guns of the time such as the pistol resembling the CC-75, the shotgun resembling the Frenchy Spaz-12, and the SMG resembling the H&K MP5K. And the combination of creating architecture that is reminiscent of dystopian societies in films of the time. Hell, even the uniforms resemble old sci-fi uniforms by the use of more simplistic outfits, but with more dark colors. This approach can also be tied to BioShock and especially Fallout for abiding by the aesthetics of their zeitgeist in an imaginative sense, similar to the reiterations of the Gothic, by creating a modern rendition of an image that has been long gone. This is done by the game being set in an isometric view instead of the conventional third-person or first-person view, which even the remastered Resident Evil and Silent Hill games have switched to. Another example is by the combat revolving around limited resources and inventory, forcing the player to be witty with their approaches, with the only other option being to run. And the last one is that being safe rooms where the player can save or manage their inventory before returning into the unknown. The last thing to solidify Signalis as a Neo-Gothic tragedy is by the absolution that surrounds the story. The feeling of isolation forces Elster to do nothing but trek forward in her search for Ariana, while rediscovering the Sierpinski, while paired with Elster's melancholic thoughts of reuniting with her lover. But as said before, in the end, despite all of Elster's efforts, they can't be together, causing arguably the greatest copium consumption ever witnessed in gaming history. Motivated by the anguish of millions of souls and rivers of tears since then, in absolute totality. In conclusion, Signalis' story of Elster's search for Ariana created a narrative of longing, melancholy, and ultimately unrequited love, hammering home on all the aspects of the Gothic and taking the form of a romantic tragedy, makes this game not only a horror masterpiece, but a testament to the long-standing tradition of Gothic media. Despite it not necessarily looking like the traditional Gothic, its archaic aesthetic of a time long gone transcends the understanding of the Gothic to a new level. As stated before, this is not necessarily an in-depth analysis of the themes of Signalis, but an in-depth look on understanding the origin and transformation of the Gothic into horror, and how the game traces back to a time that predates its now standard conventions. Well, as of now, that'll be it for my take for Signalis, and so if you want to hear me yap some more, I'm going to show you guys what I have planned for this year. For my next thesis, I want to do Void Interactive's tactical SWAT shooter and masterpiece, Ready or Not, on the theme of realism. And speaking of which, I also plan to pump out some gameplay of the Dark Waters DLC as well, so if you want some more gameplay of some sort, expect that. Around the springtime, I also plan to get back into Airsoft and rampage around the arena again, and hopefully with a new camera as well. And what else? Oh yeah, I also want to do some video game reviews, as I haven't done one of those in a while. So probably expect one for Space Marine 2 and Bodycam. And for some of you OGs, y'all would know that I used to make some GMVs, and I haven't done one in forever, and I've been wanting to do those for a while, so expect a couple to come out. Hopefully. I don't know when, but hopefully. I'm just gonna end it off here, but before I do so, you all know what I was about to say. My fellow patrons of the arts, ladies, gentlemen, everyone in between, and everyone in New Orleans, my name is Cobra, and y'all be sure to kiss the homies goodnight. Until next time.